So good to see you back in the studio, Ben.
Pleasure to be with you, Reged.
We're going to talk submarines. And there was a moment at a very recent news conference where Donald Trump was taking questions and he didn't know what AUKUS meant.
I think that moment sent a shiver up the spine of defence officials and politicians all over Australia and around the world, across a couple of oceans, in fact. AUKUS is supposed to be this centrepiece security alliance between the US, the UK and Australia. This enhanced cooperation and largely, particularly Pillar 1 of AUKUS, is built around nuclear-powered submarines. When the leader of the free world doesn't know the acronym, people feel like it's in trouble. Now, look, he recovered very quickly. Maybe he missed it with the accent. Maybe he just was somewhere else. But there are a lot of concerns emerging. And I suppose that's kind of an iceberg moment. That's this little tip of the iceberg that says, actually, there are some real problems underneath here. We don't know in what direction AUKUS is travelling, how it's going. We don't know if we're ever going to get these submarines, if Australia's ever going to see its own nuclear-powered submarines, which really was the sort of centrepiece. We're going to pay a lot of money. We've already started paying a lot of money. Are we ever going to see those submarines?
That is really the key question. And I feel like part of the niggling in that sort of anxiety probably became even more profound when we watched Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, and how he was interacting with Donald Trump, that whole disaster of a news conference. Did that create even more concern that the US has very much changed course?
I think so. And I think a lot of what we've seen in the first weeks of Donald Trump's second administration has given rise to those concerns. The sort of tumult, the turmoil, the unpredictability, the kind of sturm and drang across all of these domains has put a lot of fear into allies about, well, just how reliable is the US anymore? This great and powerful friend that Australia has relied on since the Second World War, that we depend on for our security, all of a sudden we're relying on America more than ever under this AUKUS agreement at a time when America's becoming less reliable. And that's a huge problem. It seems, and people have argued, that the closer you are to America, the worse you get treated almost, that allies are treated worse than enemies. The closer you are and the more dependent you are, the more licensed the US feels to be able to sort of treat you with disregard. And a lot of the AUKUS agreement depends on the good faith and goodwill of the US administration. The US has got to say, yes, we are going to sell you these submarines. Yes, we are going to hand them over to you and put them under your control. An America that can't be relied upon perhaps can't be relied upon to do that.
I feel like those fears weren't necessarily there under Joe Biden, which is why we went and signed the deal in the first place.
I think so. I think critics of AUKUS would say that it was always a pretty dicey deal. Essentially, the first part of the first pillar is that the US will sell us between 3 and 5 what they call Virginia-class attack submarines. These are conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines. But part of the AUKUS agreement is that the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the day, which was never going to be Joe Biden, it's not even going to be Donald Trump, has to say that selling to Australia those submarines won't diminish the US naval capacity. And it's really hard to imagine a scenario where that's the case, particularly if you look at the state of American shipbuilding at the moment. Even Donald Trump's raised this. He says we're going to start building them very, very fast, very, very soon. But submarines take a long time to build. They're incredibly expensive. They're incredibly complicated. They take a very long time. So part of the issue with AUKUS is we've always been trying to make plans for 8, 10, 12, 20, 30 years down the track, far beyond the electoral cycle that current prime ministers and presidents are going to be having to deal with. You know, you really are forecasting for the future, and you're doing it with a lot of money and a lot of uncertainty. There are so many unknowns here. AUKUS has always looked less than 100% reliable, but in the current political climate, it's looking far, far shakier.
You've been reporting on this recently. Essentially what you hint at, that the US might not be able to spare these submarines that we're supposed to get. And one of the things you reported on was that Donald Trump's top pick for the Pentagon's now saying that selling subs to Australia poses a very difficult problem. What's Eldridge Colby been saying?
Eldridge Colby is Trump's nominee for Undersecretary of Defence for Policy. Essentially, he's the number 3 man at the Pentagon. He's known as a realist, and his position on this is essentially a military manifestation of America first. It's like, we need these submarines for our own defences, for our own interests. And of course, US and Australia as very close allies, our interests often align, but they're not identical. They're not exactly the same. And the US idea that they would be selling submarines to Australia for Australians to command and control and to send them where they want to send them outside of US control is not necessarily within the US interest. If the US want these submarines in the event of a conflagration over Taiwan in that first islands chain, then the US want control of those submarines. So his argument, and he's made this argument forcefully in his nomination hearings before the Senate, is that American priorities have to come first. And that means, if that means having to disappoint an ally like Australia and say, you can't have these submarines, then that's the decision that America will have to make. And we've also seen it from an agency called the Congressional Research Service that's been looking into the state of shipbuilding and boat building in the US, and it's basically proposed an alternative saying, what if we build these additional submarines, these 3 to 5 Virginia-class submarines, but instead of selling them to Australia, putting them in Australian control, we just operate them out of Australian bases. So Australia becomes this sort of forward operating base.
What's wrong with that? Because basically we'd be paying for protection then instead of keeping the submarines for ourselves. Is that right?
Essentially, that's right. But I think the argument is that, again, to my point, that our interests are often aligned, but they're not identical. That scenario would leave those boats operating out of Australian bases, particularly in Perth and in Adelaide, but it wouldn't have them in Australian control. Australia wouldn't be in charge of where they go and when they go, and they would be beholden to American interests.
Do we know if Donald Trump cares about our region, though?
People in his administration do. People like Elbridge Colby, who he wants to put into a very senior position in the Pentagon, has certainly been very strong on America moving away from Europe, and we've certainly seen America doing that towards the Indo-Pacific and prioritising this part of the world. And Australia is a key ally here. So let's not sort of pretend that all of a sudden that the entire relationship, ANZUS, all of those things have been torn up. But it's just the old reliabilities, the old certainties don't exist anymore. And we saw that most graphically with the sort of brutal dismissal of Ukraine in the Oval Office.
We also saw a flotilla of Chinese warships near Australia recently. Has that kind of intensified all the anxiety over whether we're going to have these submarines?
I think so, and I think the timing has made that particularly acute, that at this time that we're seeing at least 3 Chinese warships, potentially accompanied by an undetected nuclear submarine, in Australia's EEZ, Exclusive Economic Zone, undertaking live fire drills in the Tasman Sea, all of which is entirely legal, entirely within keeping with international law, but it's the sort of most overt display, I suppose, we've seen from the Chinese Navy in a long, long time, and that's heightened these concerns. We are an island nation, and there are very real concerns about how you defend such a large island nation.
Let's talk money, because the US Defence Secretary, Peter Hegseth, said our first cheque has cleared $790 million, which is, I can't even imagine that amount. If we're paying the money, what are we going to get for it?
The money that's going from Australia to the US at the moment is to boost US shipbuilding. During the pandemic, they had a lot of experienced workers, a lot of experienced boat builders leave the industry, and they haven't come back. The rate of boat building has slowed, basically halved. They're not able to produce enough submarines to meet their own needs at the moment. We are paying money into their industry to bolster that shipbuilding industry because we want them to build those submarines for Australia. But there's no guarantee attached to that. That's money being given to the US industry. There's no guarantee that those Virginia-class submarines come back the other way.
So are we then essentially
subsidising the US shipbuilding industry?
Subsidising the US shipbuilding industry, maybe just paying to maintain a relationship, if nothing else?
Some defence strategists have argued that there's a real and a declared goal of AUKUS. And the declared goal of AUKUS is that we get our own sovereign-controlled, nuclear-powered submarines. The real goal that it's argued is that we're demonstrating our value to the US. We're saying we can be a good partner. We can give you some money to help with boat building. You can operate submarines out of bases in this part of the world. That's of enormous value. Things like HMAS Sterling, like Pine Gap, like bases in Exmouth are incredibly valuable to the US as a Pacific base. So what Australia is trying to do with AUKUS is demonstrate its value to that US military, to US force projection into this part of the world.
I won't ask if we can get a refund because it sounds like we might not be able to. Sounds like that money is gone. But is there any reflection here in the defence community or in the government that may be turning away from the French deal, which is where we were? We were trying to build non-nuclear subs with France. Maybe in hindsight, turning away from that wasn't a great idea?
There are people making this argument. Malcolm Turnbull, who was the Prime Minister who signed the initial deal with the French, certainly makes this argument. People like retired Rear Admiral Peter Briggs, who was a submariner, makes the argument that the AUKUS deal simply isn't going to work for Australia. The submarines that we're going to get, if we get them at all, and he thinks we won't get them, are going to be too big, too difficult to crew, too expensive to maintain and run, and it simply won't work. And they both argue going back to the French. Now, you talked about money for nothing. We had to pay $830 million basically as a default for reneging on the Naval Group contract that we initially had with the French. So we've already spent a lot of money for no submarines.
So could AUKUS end up costing us more than the French deal if we'd stayed there?
AUKUS will undoubtedly be more expensive. AUKUS is forecast to cost in excess of $350 billion out to about 2050. We are talking enormous sums of money. But there is an argument that Australia should go back to the French. They have what's called a Submarine class boat, which can be a nuclear-powered boat. In production, they are smaller, they are easier to crew. France is an ally. France is a Pacific nation. France is a boat-building country.
And perhaps arguably more of a stable ally at the moment.
That's certainly an argument that's being put forward, and particularly if the deal is more straightforward in that case, in that we are simply paying for France to build these submarines. Now, whether they're built in France, whether they're built in Australia, those sorts of details need to be worked out. But the idea is that we are buying the submarines for Australia, for Australian control. They would be crewed by Australians, they would be commanded by Australian officers, and they'd be under the control of the Australian government. They'd be sovereign submarines.
We are an island nation, and I've never quite understood why it's been so difficult to get our own subs. I mean, the UK manages it. They're an island. Why historically has it been so hard for us?
Submarines have, for lots of reasons, long presented a logistical and sort of political turmoil for Australian governments. Australia got its first submarines in 1914. The first one we ever had, about 7 months into service, hit the bottom of the sea off Papua New Guinea, and all hands were lost. We were given submarines by the British following the First World War. They were pretty obsolete. We sold them within a few years. There has been this difficulty with committing long-term, I suppose, to building submarines and controlling our submarines. The Collins class, which are our current fleet, had a lot of difficulties in being brought online and put into the ocean. It has historically presented problems for Australia for all of the reasons we've discussed. They are incredibly complex things. They often say that generals, and I suppose in this case you'd say admirals, are very good at planning for the last war. We need to be planning for the next war. You know, there's even talk about, well, do we need submarines? Are submarines going to be superseded by unmanned underwater vehicles, you know, essentially drones of the sea? This is a really hard thing to forecast, where the technology is going to take us and what's going to best defend Australia, not tomorrow and not next year, but in 10 years and in 20 years.
We're going into an election. Is any new government going to have to sort this out? Are they going to have to decide what they're going to do here? Or are your analysts telling you that we're just going to have to keep on the course at the moment?
The original French deal was signed under a coalition government. The AUKUS deal was signed by Scott Morrison, a coalition prime minister, and then adopted by Anthony Albanese as a Labor prime minister. So there is an element of bipartisanship on the AUKUS deal. Both sides of politics want to see this come off, want to see those subs come to Australia and be under Australian control. But there is emerging concern within the defence community, within experts internationally, that it simply isn't going to work. Now, whether a future government, and we are facing an election within a couple of months in Australia, sits down and says, okay, do we need to make a decision here, or do we just continue to push on with AUKUS? That's a decision a future government's going to sit down and make. I think these concerns around AUKUS are going to continue to be ventilated. I think we're going to hear them from both sides of the Pacific. We're going to hear them coming from the US side. We're going to hear them coming from the Australian side. It's going to be a very brave decision either way. And governments are kind of very used to making decisions and seeing results quickly. That doesn't happen with these sorts of deals. We are talking tens, we're talking in decades, we're talking in generations. It's a really difficult piece of public policy. You are dealing with lots of money and long lead times and the potential for things to go wrong. And I think, as you've alluded to earlier, all of a sudden, this once dependable great ally that we thought we could rely on, that we understood how it worked and how it operated, and we had close relations with, and we still do, but it's not the same ally that it was, the US.
Just finally, what is the worst case scenario with AUKUS? Could it collapse completely? Could we hand over our money and get absolutely nothing for it? I mean, where could this go?
I think that is the worst case scenario. I think there is a very real chance that we will hand over hundreds of millions of dollars into the billions of dollars, and ultimately come 2031, when it's time for that first Virginia-class submarine to be sold to Australia, the US will say, sorry, we simply don't have the boat to spare. You can't have one. And then we're going to be stuck. And in naval circles, they talk about a capability gap. The Collins class is becoming an old submarine now. The first ones were in the water in 1996. They will either have to be extended to sort of cover that until we can get some submarines, or we are left without that capability. And as we've discussed, an island nation with an immense coastline, that's a very difficult and dangerous scenario for Australia to be in.
Ben, thank you so much for taking us through those ramifications, and I'm sure we'll be talking about this again at some point.
Again and again and again. Thanks so much, Reged.
Thank you. Is there any indication that the US sees anything in the AUKUS deal for them?
Absolutely. And I think that's how it's been pitched very strongly, is that this interoperability, which is the kind of military term for it, the two militaries, the two navies being able to work together, is of enormous benefit to the US. The US see huge benefits in the military relationship with Australia, again, for those bases like HMAS Sterling, like bases in Exmouth, like Pine Gap in the Northern Territory. All of those assets that they have great access to benefit them enormously. And that's how Australia is able to sort of demonstrate its utility, I suppose, to the US, which is still by far the largest military in the world.